Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of The Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon, and I'm your host. I'm also the creator and the moderator of TheChocolateLife.com. And today, we're going to be covering what I think is going to be a really, really important topic when we talk about the ideas of fair trade, of doing good in the world, of helping cocoa farmers and other farmers improve lives and livelihoods. And that's to talk about the concept of what fair means, what is fair, and who gets to decide what fair is. So, as always, please go into the comments, whether you're watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, or Facebook, and give us a shout out. Let us know where in the world that you're connecting from, and I can get that up on the screen. And of course, if you have any comments or any questions, any point during the hour, put them in the comments, and I will get them up on the screen, and we'll look to get them asked and answered. And with that, I just want to go in and start right in with today's topic. I want to start off by reminding everybody that this is the homepage of The Chocolate Life right now. It is live. So if you were to go to thechocolatelife.com right now, this is exactly what it is that you'd see. Right. I want to point out for people who are new that I've been working on improvements to the navigation. So scrunching it up and reducing the number of elements. You'll notice that there are some arrows next to some menu items, and if you click, there's now submenus. And then you can click again and the menus disappear. So hopefully that will make everything a whole lot easier to use. But for every single one, for every single one of the Chocolate Life live streams, I put together a post. And this post explains what the live stream is going to be about. And then if you also scroll down, so here's an episode overview. It lets you know what the episode is going to be about. Who decides what's fair is the topic of today's episode. I asked the question on LinkedIn. So here's the question on LinkedIn. And you'll see that there is a card. If you click, you can go to that. And the reason why I do this is so that you don't actually have to follow along with the URLs. You don't have to look for links or anything like that. You can go to this page and you can follow along from there, right? And if you're a member of The Chocolate Life, you can go comment, if not on LinkedIn, on this post on The Chocolate Life, all right? So what I want to start off with today is this general introduction, and it's something that I've talked about a number of times on The Chocolate Life, which is that language matters. The words we use affect what we believe. Our beliefs affect our actions, and our actions have consequences. Therefore, it's really, really important to understand what we mean when we use particular words. So what does the word fair mean? What does ethical mean? What does equitable mean? Right? These are really, really important concepts. So to be able to have definitions that we can use and that we can share with others. I mean, I've often shared my definition for what sustainability means. So when I say that something is sustainable, this is what I'm referring to, right? And if anybody wants me to repeat my definition of sustainable, let me know, and I will. I don't think it's necessary for the purposes of today's conversation to do that. But with that, so one of the ways that I describe sort of ethical behavior, when I say ethical, what does being ethical mean? What it says, what I think is that behaving ethically leads to, among other things, right? Importantly, not exploiting a power imbalance to take unfair advantage of others. Right? So being ethical means that you recognize you might be in a position of power, and somehow you're going to use that position of unequal power to make sure that you have more advantage than the other people that you're entering into relationship with, business or other kinds of relationship with. And I think that, as a definition for ethical, I think that's a really easy to understand one. And also it makes very, very clear what being unethical is, right? And notice that it's got the word fair, unfair in it. So there is a connection that we have there to being ethical and behaving ethically and being fair. But if you just want a straight up definition of what the word fair means, one of them is marked by justice, honesty, and freedom from bias. And so one of the things that that definition of fair might suggest is that I've actually done enough self-examination to know what my biases are, and I'm entering into this relationship knowing what those biases are and putting them aside. So I think that it's not necessarily what most people think of when they think of as fair, but I think that freedom from bias, in addition to being this notion of justice and honesty, is really, really important, right? And that when we talk about equitable, one definition is having or exhibiting equity. I think that's a little circular. Equitable and equity, in, similar words in the same definition, again, is a little circular, but it says dealing fairly and equally. So there's a notion that fair having to do with equal. So I think that's an interesting point. One thing you'll see here, this is a link to a video, and if you're on the Chocolate Life Live, you can go click this video and watch it without having to leave the page. You don't have to go to YouTube and watch it. But one of the things, I mean, if you do know this channel, Mapmen, it's a great channel. I've learned a lot of really interesting stuff from it. But this particular video talks about where is north and why is north up on maps today, when in different times in the world, north was what we would call east, right, today. And so east was up because that's where the sun came from in the morning, right? And so it makes sense to orient things towards where the sun came from. It is only with compasses that we changed that orientation, and north became one of the directions where compasses pointed. But in here, they make a really interesting point, which is that there is an assumption that we have when we use the word north, that somehow north is better and somehow north is more powerful, right, than the south. And this is a cultural assumption. It is a language assumption. It's baked into a lot of people that one of the things that you might want to consider, and it's certainly something that I have considered over the last year or so and have made it a point to avoid using wherever possible, is that the words global north and global south assume that the north is somehow superior to the south, that we here in the global north, right, have an unfair advantage over people who are in the global south. And I'm going to suggest that everybody just stop using that language immediately, because what it does is it sets up a bias in your mind, right? And you no longer, if you want to be fair, you're no longer free from this bias that somehow being in the north is better than being in the south, right? And the challenge becomes, well, what am I going to use if I'm not going to use global north or global south? How do I get around this notion and do something which is, from a language perspective, is fairly neutral? And what I've come up with, and it's what it is that I use now, is that the notion is that we have producing countries, right? So these are what we might call origin countries. So a producing country, a cocoa producing country, would be Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, as two examples. But producing countries also include the United States. We grow in Hawaii. Japan is also a producing country, and they're in the quote unquote global north. So think about using producing countries instead of global south, right? Because it is more neutral language, and that here in the United States and the EU and other places, we are primarily consuming countries when it comes to things like cocoa and sugar. So producing countries and consuming countries, and we're no longer carrying around this bias that we here in the global north are in a privileged position because we are above all of these countries in the global south, that physically on the map, we are above them. And that gives us a privileged position. And if you don't actually think about that privileged position, what does that mean, right? So before I jump into the next part of this morning's discussion, what I want to do is give a quick shout out to Josh Parker, a longtime friend and colleague of mine and a friend of the Chocolate Life. Josh is, I think, normally in Idaho, but for some reason he's in Texas at the moment. So hope that things aren't way too hot where you are. I'd also like to give a quick shout out to Natalia Evangelista from Altamira, Brazil. Altamira is this wonderful small town. I was there about a year ago for Chocolate Xingu, which is a festival. It's in the state of Pará, not far from Belém, and it's if you ever get a chance to go to Brazil and you're interested in cocoa and chocolate, get out of the state of Bahia, go to Pará, and get a chance to go visit visit these smaller towns. Maybe there, the state of Acre, places like that. Some really, really interesting stuff going on there. Also, to give a quick shout out to Silvino Reyes Capriles, who's from Venezuela, I'm guessing, given that. So, Silvino, thank you very much. Also, to say hello to Lila Carvajal, who is, again, a friend of the Chocolate Life. We're a collaborator of the Chocolate Life, a supporter of what it is that we're doing here through her business, Cocoa Supply, which is headquartered in Ecuador, but is in the United States as well as in the EU. So Lila, glad to hear you chiming in this morning, and thank you very much for your contributions to the post over on LinkedIn, and also to give a quick shout out to Mark and Yuri from Blue Spruits in Kittredge, Colorado, and we'll get into this economic imperialism, a point that I make. So let's continue. So again, I pointed out homework in advance in this episode. What unconscious value judgments might we be making when you use the phrase global north and global south? Right? I think it's really, really important to go and do that. So over on LinkedIn, so what I've started doing for these episodes, let me make a quick jump back. So there are a number of posts in the series. There have been 4 prior ones in this series. The first one was about a month ago, and it was titled Just One Change. And the idea being is if there was just one change that you could make in the world of cocoa and chocolate, what would that be? And this is the first time I post this question in advance of an episode of the Chocolate Life Live, and I put it up on LinkedIn, and I got a lot of response. Now, following that, I wanted to ask everyone in advance, why do we want to improve quality of cocoa? If we can't actually improve the price of cocoa, why should we worry about improving the quality of cocoa? There's no direct relationship between higher quality and higher price. So why do it? Right. That was followed by an episode on climate change. Is cocoa a cause? Is it a solution to climate change? Turns out it's a little bit of both. And then last week we had this discussion about whether or not Tony's Chocolonely was a force for good in the world. And so I wanted to follow those episodes up with this episode of what do we mean by fair, right? And I did get some responses, surprisingly not as many as I thought I would, on the chocolate on LinkedIn. And we'll go through those responses, and I will respond to the comments that we got. But I want to, give a quick shout out to this image. I was in Venezuela in 2006. I was with Sean Espinosa, who's in Tanzania at the moment, with a Chocolate University trip. And we visited a small cooperative in the state, in an area called Barlovento in Miranda State, which is east of Caracas, south of the Caranero region. Visited a cooperative where we wanted to purchase some cocoa, and we had a chance to play with some of the children. And children are going to be children no matter where you go. And the answer to the question, who decides what's fair, has a material effect on these kids. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to include their photos here. If we go take a look at the post for today, this is a mother who is in that same cooperative that we visited in 2006. And so when I think about sort of the position that farmers often find themselves in, this sort of pensive pose of like, am I going to be able to make things work, is evocative to me. It's emotionally evocative to me of the question. All right. So I made the point in my post here. I did a spoiler alert, and we get to that spoiler alert, and it's right here. All right. So over the course of the last nearly 20 years of working in cocoa and chocolate, or more than 20 years of working in cocoa and chocolate, I have come to believe that fair trade programs, right, are in fact most often little more than socially acceptable neo-colonial economic imperialism. That somehow the notion of fair has made it socially acceptable to engage in policies that, when you look at them, are in fact economic imperialism. And Clay, right, how can you possibly have come to that opinion? And I come to that opinion, and I'm really, really interested in knowing what other people think about it. Mark, thank you for pointing out that you agree, economic imperialism, right? That's what this is, right? Is that it's sort of based on the notion that after hundreds of years of colonial oppression, so Europeans, for the most part, have gone out, they've looked to conquer other countries and turn them into colonies. Why do they want them as colonies? Because they want the resources, mineral resources, perhaps gold and silver, other economic resources, and places to grow things like sugar, right? So they're looking to conquer these lands so that they can use, so they can control the resources. And those resources include people, right? And there's a lot of illegal labor, a lot of slavery of all kinds, whether you call it modern or chattel or indentured servitude, whatever you call it, just a lot of pretty heinous um, 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 labor inequities that are associated with colonialism, right? And so what happened, right, in my opinion, is that at some point, right, some of the people, the descendants of people, started gaining some sort of conscience. And they said, we did bad, right? And we've got some new ideas and some new morals, and we've got values that we didn't have, right? And what we want to do is we want to make some amends, right? And so what they do is they go to producing countries, they go to farmers and producers in countries and say, we would like you to accept our values. So we have ideas about equity and being fair, right? And among other things, they involve meticulous record keeping, right? And we know that you don't care about record keeping, or culturally, right? You have never cared about record keeping. But in our world, in order for us to be able to prove our values, we need to be able to prove that these things happened, and therefore we need to keep meticulous records. And so what we want you to do is you want to accept our values, right? We're going to pay you a premium, right, for accepting our values. So we're going to give you a little bit of money more than you would normally get on the open market, right? But you also have to pay for the privilege of accepting our values. And that comes in the form of fees for certification. So if you want to be certified fair trade, right, right, you have to pay money to be certified, right? And that certification is going to prove that you followed up, you ticked off all the boxes in our checklist, right? And you're going to send that information along with the product up the supply chain, right? And we're going to get it, and we're going to make sure that you get paid more money for the products you produce that are certified. But at the same time, we, the certification organization, are not going to accept any of the market risk. So we're not actually we're going to guarantee that you get paid more, you're going to pay more premium, but we're not actually going to buy the product from you and pay you the premium. And then we take responsibility for making sure that that product is purchased. So we're asking you to pay for the privilege of accepting our values, while at the same time leaving you with all of the market risk. So what happens is that it is very rare when 100% of the product that is produced, right, that is produced under a fair trade certified regime, whether it is FLO, Fair Trade Fair Trade International, Fair Trade USA, you name the fair trade certification, Rainforest Alliance, any one of these things, right? It is very rare that the cooperative, right, that is certified is able to sell 100% of its products, right, in a way that they get the premium for all 100%. So what that means is there's some aspect of the certification, right, that they might end up having to pay for, right? So they are being required to pay for the privilege of accepting our values, while taking on 100% of the market risk, right? And that's why I say that fair trade programs, as currently constituted, are little more than neocolonial economic imperialism, right? And we've done it in such a way, we've wrapped it up in this language, right, that says, oh, we're being fair because, right, we have decided that we know what is fair better than the farmers. So when we say the fair trade floor price is X, right, we've set that because it's fair. When we say here is the fair trade premium, right, we've set that because we've decided what's fair. Now, right, you may say to me, but hey, Clay, there's a meeting every once in a while where, for example, representatives of fair trade will get together with some farmers and they'll get to determine what the fair trade premium is jointly. So farmers do have some input into the process, and that may be true. But normally what people seem to overlook, or often rather than normally, what people seem to overlook is that representatives of big cocoa and big chocolate are in those negotiations as well. And there's a fundamental conflict of interest that's going on there. So number one, big chocolate wants to make sure that the price of cocoa is as low as possible, right? Because they have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize return to shareholders. So they're in these negotiations in order to be able to protect their own interests. The higher the price of cocoa, the worse the balance sheets look like, right? The less they return to investors and shareholders, and you run the risk of there being a shareholder lawsuit because they're not doing everything they can to maximize return, right? So big cocoa and big chocolate, publicly traded companies, have this fiduciary responsibility, and privately held companies, in order to remain competitive, have to engage in the same practices in order to be able to put products on the shelves at a price that is competitive with others. But if you have representatives of cocoa farmers from 4 different countries, and let's just pick Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon, because they happen to be physically fairly closely located. Between them, they represent the vast majority of cocoa that is produced in the world. What we forget to understand often, or overlook, or do not calculate into our considerations, is that the cost of living in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana and Nigeria and Cameroon are different. Right? And what that suggests is that the fair trade premium should be different in each of those 4 countries, right? In order to truly be fair. Something that is a fair price in one country might be too low in another country. Something that is too low in another country may be high in another country. And it could come down to as little as a penny. This is a fictitious example, but if country A says, well, we would, in order to be fair, right, and bring us in parity, which is maybe a more interesting way of saying equity or equitable, right? We're in parity, we're on a par, it's all the same. So we've got this parity here. In order for us to be in parity with our neighbor, right, we need to have a premium that is 1 cent per kilo higher than the country next door, because our economy, right, runs at a different scale and things are more expensive here, right? And what will happen then is that we will put into their mind, but if we want a higher premium, what it does is it puts our cocoa at an economic disadvantage. We're now more expensive than next door, right? And so we're willing to accept the lower premium, right, so that we don't put ourselves at an economic disadvantage. And so perhaps I am suggesting that these kinds of multi-stakeholder negotiations can put negative pricing pressure on what the premium is. So who decides what's fair when it comes to living income, the living income reference standard, the living income differential? In reality, being completely unpolitically correct, why is it that a person who was born in an EU country, has spent their entire life in an EU country, has barely left the EU, to go to a producing country, right, has gone to a university, is in a position of privilege. How come they get to decide just because they have an MBA or got a doctorate in economics? How come they have a voice in who is deciding what a living income means, right, for someone living in another country, right? And this is a fundamental cognitive challenge, a bit of cognitive dissonance that I have, is that the people who are deciding, for the most part, what a living income is, right, have never, I'm not going to say have never, I want to say something different, come from a position of privilege. They may recognize that privilege, but I don't think that they understand the dissonance associated with their taking the positions that they're taking when it comes to this. Who decides what's fair, right? I would not try to tell a cocoa farmer what is a fair price for cocoa, right, before I spent a year or two or three trying to raise a family in a cocoa farm in a producing country, right? Then I might have an idea of how much work is involved and what it actually costs, right? And what a local unit of currency, whatever a dollar is in local, actually buys, right? Until then, I don't think that I have any right to have any decision about deciding for someone else what fair is, right? And I'm really, really interested in knowing what you think about that, right? What you think about is fair. Does it make sense for doing this? Is my whole proposition, right, that fair trade, however it is constituted, whatever it is called, right? How do the people who run these fair trade organizations, the vast majority of which are in European capitals like Bonn, right, or American capitals like San Francisco, right? How do they get to decide what it is that's fair, right? So let's just, because I think it's really, really important to do that. Not all of these links are in the post yet, but I will put these links in the post. This is from an organization, World Fair Trade Organizations, the WFTO, and they have a page where they talk about the history of fair trade. It's interesting. I mean, from their point of view, this is the history, but they talk about 60 years of fair trade, going back roughly to a period just after World War II, when we find that their organizations, many of them religiously motivated, right, started getting involved with first small handicraft movements and selling handicrafts in church-owned stores around the country. First in the USA, and then in the UK by Oxfam. And so this is an interesting look. Again, I will put a link to it in the post for the Chocolate Life today, but the World Fair Trade Organization discussion of the history of fair trade. What I would suggest you do is don't take one source for this. And Wikipedia is not always the best source in the world, but it's a good source against which to compare a lot of other sources, right? So here is the Wikipedia article on the history of fair trade. And what it suggests is the fair trade movement actually goes back to the early 1800s, right? Right, and through the Quaker movements, and we find, again, the Society of Friends, we'll find that the notion of trying to do fairer trade is one which, again, comes from religious traditions, but is much older than the WFTO position of it starting after World War II. Now, one of the things that I had always wondered, so in the summer of 2001, so almost exactly, was it July in 2001, I was at the Fancy Food Show in New York City, and that's where I met Frederick Schilling, the founder of Dagoba Chocolate, one of the founders of Dagoba Chocolate, for the first time. And he was talking about having his chocolate being fair trade certified by an organization called Max Avelar. I had never really thought to wonder where the name Max Avelar came from. But in this article on Wikipedia, what we do is we find that there was a novel written in the 1850s by a Dutch author by the name of Edward Louis Dekker, or maybe Louis Dekker, who has questioned the injustice of the colonial and capitalist systems towards commodity producer in a novel by the name of Max Abelaar. And the titular Max Abelaar is a Dutch trade company employee who leaves everything to work in solidarity with local Indonesian workers. And so that's where Max Abelaar came from. In case anybody was interested, that was the discovery, one of the discoveries that I made um, about fair trade in the process of doing the research on this. And then there's a larger description about fair trade initiatives than the one that the World Fair Trade Organization puts together. And if you read back and forth between the two of them, you get a more comprehensive view of what the history of the fair trade movement is. But what we find is that the modern fair trade movement, what we think of as the modern fair trade movement, is something that comes out of the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. And this is where we start working towards non-governmental organizations that are not necessarily associated with religious organizations. And they're trying to put together a systematized way to go and recognize when something is fairly traded as opposed to when something is not fairly traded. And we see a mix not only just of handcrafts, but also move much more into agricultural commodities. That is relatively recent. Now, I think it's very, very confusing for a lot of people when they think about what fair trade is, because we have, right? This is Fair Trade USA, right? We have Fair Trade America. Fair Trade America is actually part of Fair Trade International. You can go take a look, right, at this seal, and we go, oh, I recognize what Fair Trade America is. It's somehow related to Fair Trade International. But hey, there's this thing called Fair Trade, and it's using a very, very different symbol. And how is this, what does this Fair Trade symbol mean compared to another fair trade symbol? So one of the things that has happened over the course of the last 20 years is there's now a fair trade industry. There are now meta organizations. There are organizations of fair trade producers, right, who get together to promote fair trade, right? And what's interesting, again, what they're doing is they're promoting the interests of fair trade organizations. Not one of these organizations that I am aware of will take economic responsibility, right, for 100% of the goods and agricultural products, right, that they certify, right? They're not taking any market risk associated with this. And that is the fundamental challenge I have. And it's one of the reasons why I don't believe that any so-called fair trade organizations are in fact fair, right? Because there is a power imbalance there. There's an economic imbalance there, and they're using that economic and power imbalance, right, to unfairly take advantage of people, which is my definition of unethical. Right? And so, it's really, really interesting to, try to understand exactly, where this comes from and how to untangle it, because what does this all mean? So I'm going to go to another company, Equal Exchange, right? It's founded in the United States. It's interesting in the sense that it is a cooperative itself, so it's an employee-owned organization. They have a mission to build long-term trade partnerships that are economically just and environmentally sound. They want to foster mutually beneficial relationships between farmers and consumers, and to demonstrate through their success the contribution to worker cooperatives. Fair trade will lead to a more equitable, democratic, and sustainable world. So we get this equal exchange, bunch of arrows, north and south, up and down, right? Right? North and south. So I think they're perpetuating this north-south divide. They're somehow going to come together in the middle, however, and they are what it is that's fairly traded. And we find they work in coffee and chocolate and tea and other kinds of foods. And all of these things are really, really, really interesting. But let's go take a look, dig a little deeper, all right? And I'm doing this just because I'm doing equal exchange because it came to me and because it was easy to find these particular resources. Last week, I used Tony's Chocolonely annual report, and you should go and use the the approach that I proposed looking at Tony's report to look at the equal exchange report and other reports when you can find them, right? But one of the things that we find is that when it comes to annual reports, the last annual report is 2019. So yeah, 2020, 2021, really, really a challenge, global pandemic, right? But we haven't seen a up-to-date report, right? And so we don't know anything about the financials. So they're talking about being equitable, they're talking about money and all these kinds of things, and we don't actually know what they're talking about. And so here's a PDF of their annual report, right? Excuse me, let us reload this, right? I had this open earlier, there we go, right? And so what I want to suggest here, all right, really, really importantly, is that you go and take a read of the annual report. Number one, right? So what's a challenge for me, right, is they've got this graphic here on this page where they're talking about sales growth over the course of the last, what, 20, 30 some odd years, 33 years, 86 to 2019, and 19 and 40, yeah, 33 years. And what they've done is they've mixed these graphics here. So 2004 is all the way over to the left, when 2004 is more to the right. 2004 is over here, but 2004 is over here. It's a little bit challenging to understand what it is that's going on. They're pointing to things, right? So, this mixed metaphor in this graph makes it much more difficult to read, right? And then they've got this graph here where you actually have numbers. So of the 80.9 million in sales after 30 some odd years, they're doing less than 100 million in sales, and you can see what the breakdown of the sales are. So, right, but again, when it comes to sales, right, so we have these things called EEUK products, but we don't know how much of the let me scale up here, how much it says EEUK products right here. We don't know if those EEUK products are tea or chocolate and cocoa or coffee. They're mixing metaphors again here. So it becomes challenges to understand what these numbers actually mean. Look very, very closely at them. One of the things that I wanted to do, right, is I wanted to understand if anywhere in this annual report it mentioned who is manufacturing their chocolate, right? So what you can do is, because we're in Acrobat, we can just type the word chocolate, and we can find every time the word chocolate appears 24 times, and you will not find anywhere a mention of the company that is manufacturing their chocolate here. So when it comes from a transparency perspective, right, I'm kind of dubious as to understanding. So why is that important, right? And if anybody from Equal Exchange or anybody knows, put it into the comments. Let me know if you know who is manufacturing the chocolate for Equal Exchange. Why is that important? Tony's Chocolate Only, they have their chocolate manufactured for them by Barry Callebaut. And so while Tony's cacao supply chain may be independent from Barry Callebaut's cocoa supply chain, their manufacturing capabilities are not, right? And so are we going to give Tony's a pass, right, for their work on reducing child labor, right, while they are benefiting from the economies of scale of Barry Callebaut, arguably one of the largest beneficiaries of this illegal labor, right? What the Equal Exchange people say here: intractable issues of poverty, inequality, and child labor. So they say it's intractable, right, in their report. But I want to know where, right, the chocolate is actually manufactured. So, all right, and I can't find it anywhere, right? So I would like to know, right, where the chocolate is manufactured. Now, you can also go through, there's lots of good stories and all this kind of stuff. We want to buy into the story. It makes an enormous amount of sense, right? But then what we want to do is we want to go in, how many pages are we in now? We're 20 pages in. Here's where we're coming and looking at the actual, the numbers associated with this. And one of the reasons why we get to numbers is there's an interesting program that has been suggested, is that we understand what the cost of sales is, right? So this looks to be inventory, right? Right, and we have operating expenses, which are different. So of the $81 million roughly in total sales, the actual stuff they were selling cost them nearly 60 million, right? They spent another um, nearly 20 million in overhead, so administration, other kinds of things like that. And they had a net income before taxes of a little under $2 million, and they paid out $850,000 in shareholder dividends. But again, coming back through all of this, right, there's not a discussion of where the chocolate is made. We don't know about the distribution of capital and who is benefiting from all of this stuff, right? And so from fairly traded, do we know? Because we don't know the relationship between Equal Exchange and the company that's manufacturing their chocolate for them. So we don't understand about what that means. Now that brings me to a conversation or comment that was made on my post on LinkedIn. A woman by the name of Ines Burris, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, in Switzerland, has saying that she is a founder in a new project, which is called Equal Profit. I've linked to that on the page, for the post for today's page, and they have two certifications, Transparent Profit and Equal Profit. Right? And so I say here it's an interesting concept, right? And I looked at their website, and we'll go here. I looked at the website, right? And I said, I have a problem understanding what is going on. I think it's a really, really interesting concept. What we want to do is we want to change the it's a reporting relationship. We want to change the relationship among and between all of the people who are in the chain from the farm through to the retailer, right? And they've got this they've got this really interesting concept that what we want to do is we want to make sure that profits are distributed equitably, profits are distributed equally. And right, again, I mean, I'll talk about this all day long, right? This graph is really, really hard to decode, right? Right, just put the numbers in a table, right? And let me know what they are. You don't need to be pretty, right? Putting this thing in here, it really, really hard to know. So when it comes to this particular partner, the Banyan Alliance, right? What they said, the average price of what, right, is 65.62 Swiss francs per kilogram. I'm guessing it is chocolate. I don't know. We can go to the Banyan website and figure it out. But of this, the farmers get a certain percentage. The Farmers Association gets another association, gets more. I'm not particularly clear on what they think the difference is between a farmer association and a farmer cooperative is. The chocolate factory, that's whoever is manufacturing the chocolate for them. They've got sourcing, obviously, which takes the largest percentage of what the price is. And it's not clear to me that sourcing also includes logistics. Maybe it does, but there's a difference between the price of cocoa. I mean, I don't understand how this all works together here. And this graph here doesn't help me understand the relationship between all of these things. So I would suggest. And then there's this bar chart here, because chocolate bars. And so it's hard for me to understand, could I put all three of these things in the same format so I can get them together? We have these overlapping circles that are here, and which are really, really difficult to decode and put together. The 5.3, the circle, the colors, these really thin lines. I mean, it's just, this is not designed. These graphs are not designed, right, to be able to make it easy for me to decode and understand what's going on, right? So equal profit means that every actor earns a profit that is proportional to their costs. And that's not equal. It's not the same. It might be equitable. It might be profit on a parity, but we're not all making the same profit. What we're doing is we're making a profit that is related to our costs associated with doing whatever it is that we're doing, right? And so I would challenge, right, Ines and her team to rethink the way that they're presenting this information, right, and also to make the information available in spreadsheets, right? Because part of being transparent, part of being having a commitment to transparency is that other people can get their hands on the underlying data, right? And be able to put it into programs that will let them do their own analysis, right? How would I compare, for example, what it is that I know here with, what it is that I know about what Uncommon Cacao is doing? There's no way for me to do that, right? How do I go and compare the benefits of system A and system B? I can't do that. And that's one of the things that I want to be able to do. And I think that when you're talking about radical transparency, I think that's really important. There's another really interesting thing that's going on here, is that if I look at the people who are involved in cocoa and chocolate and certified products, right? So that's where we are, right? Is that we have, I'm sorry, I did click on that. So let's go back to the cocoa page, right? What I have here is I have a cooperative, right? Unión y Progreso Asociación, which I believe is in Ecuador, right? It is a member of, so it is a small association, which is part of a larger association called Unocase, which is in Ecuador. So we've got that, so we know that this is in Ecuador, right? Right, and we've got a chocolate manufacturer here by the name of Ecuatoriana, who's up in Quito, the largest private label chocolate manufacturer, I believe, in Ecuador. And we have this company called Banyan Alliance, which is in France. So one of the things that people might want to know, and I want to give a real quick shout out to Lila Carvajal in her response, and this is something that we had discussed, right? So is that one of the things that's really interesting about the country of Ecuador, right, is that every single cocoa transaction, as a matter of fact, like every transaction that you can think of, if I go to a restaurant, right, and I want to be able to write it off as a business expense, I need to have a special receipt. And that receipt is actually publicly recorded in a tax database, right, that anybody can go to and take a look at. So every single cocoa transaction that Cocoa Supply makes in Ecuador, right, there is a receipt for. And if what you want to do is a buyer of cocoa or other products from Cocoa Supply, and literally anybody else in the country, you should be able to go and say, I want to see the receipt, right, that was filed with the government for tax collection purposes that proves that this is exactly what you paid, right? And so knowing that, right, what I want to know with the people at Equal Profit is show me the receipts, right? If you're doing all of these things and you have all these things, make them available. If anybody asks for them, show them, right? If you're talking about being transparent, this is part of being transparent, right? I think it's really, really important in order to be able to do that. We have the Banyan Alliance, interestingly, so we can go to their page, right? They talk about beyond fair trade, fairly traded. It's an interesting company. I haven't tasted any of their chocolate. I think I would like to taste some of their chocolate. It's all sold out at the moment. But they're looking at this usual distribution. So these are images here that we've seen. It's a chocolate bar. How much of this goes to the farmer? How much of it goes to the chocolate maker? How much it goes to the retailers, right? And what's really interesting is, guys, if you're using these visualizations, well, use the same visualization, right? Don't do this bar graph over here with these circles and all this kind of stuff and this circular chart over here. To make it easy for us to understand and compare the difference, how your model is better, right, than all these other models, put your data into this format, into this quote unquote literal chocolate bar format, right? That way I can make a one-to-one comparison. It is next to impossible, right, to be able to compare. And I would say next to impossible, it is to the point of being impossible to make a meaningful comparison between these graphs and these graphs, right? And so please do everyone a favor by doing it. Now, I'm not trying to criticize the idea. I think that we need, to borrow a cooking metaphor, we need to be cooking lots of different shapes of pasta, and we need to be throwing them against lots of different vertical surfaces and to figure out what sticks. Right? This is not a one size fits all proposition, and there are lots of different models, and let's explore lots of different models. I think there are some really interesting concepts here. One of the things that you might want to take from a project that I proposed in 2009 or 2010 called 5% for Farmers, that what you actually do is you actually have the accounting companies, right? For each one of these organizations, you have the accounting companies write a statement as a part of the annual tax return processing, attesting to all this information. So there is independent of you as a certification organization, right? Attestation by a company who is legally required not to lie about tax filings, right? To be able to put together an attestation for what things mean. This is not to say what it is that you're doing is not good, right? I mean, it's hard to tell. You don't have a whole lot of people who've bought into the idea yet. But this notion of being more open about who is making what and talking about the equitable distribution of profits, that, it's like, for example, I believe it's at Equal Exchange, they have a covenant that says that the most highly paid employee can't earn more than 4 times the lowest paid employee. I think that's great, right? But what we want to know here is we're similar kinds of understanding in terms of what's going on in terms of the numbers that you're producing, as a way of saying, perhaps take some of these ideas and see which ones of them make sense in the context of what it is that you're doing. I think it's a really, really interesting idea, right? To be open and above board. Open above board's the wrong word. I'm sorry. To provide more visibility, and visibility is a word that I like a lot more than transparency here. Provide more visibility to what these things all mean. But please, please, please find somebody who is really, really good at developing information graphics and visualizations, and put it together, because these don't cut it. If you don't know, you can go look at a work called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information by Edward Tufte, and any one of the books in that series to talk about the importance of visualizations and what they mean, and go take a look at what it means, right? And how to go about making the information. And so this is the Banyan Alliance. This is their website, and what they're doing is they're using the visualizations that have been prepared by the Equal Profit Organization, right? So, I mean, again, right, let's forget what boxes are. It's not a matter of thinking outside the box. Let's forget what boxes are. Let's try to create entirely new frameworks. How are we going to go do that? And how are we going to provide confidence? In the end, this is what it's all about. We want to give consumers, we want to give all of the trading partners confidence that the information they get from trading partners, they can turn around, and when they present this information to consumers, that everybody can rely on that number. They can have confidence in what is being represented. And I think that's a large part, I think, of what it means to be fair, right? Is that part of being fair, right, is having confidence, right, having confidence in what it is that we're being told, right? Now, because we, right, have experience, and firsthand experience, so we, people being in the cocoa and chocolate industry, understand the disconnect between what it is that Big Cocoa and Big Chocolate are saying about the great job they are doing at reducing deforestation, or about reducing illegal child labor in West Africa, right? We know that what they're saying and the reality of the situation on the ground does not match. And therefore, I don't apportion a whole lot of confidence to anything that they have to say, right, when it comes to what it is that they're doing, right? And fundamentally, I think that that is unethical. I think that fundamentally it is unfair, right? And that we, if what it is that we want to do is we want to give our customers confidence in what it is that we're doing. And excuse me if you can hear construction that's going on outside. They're doing some window replacement on the building. I don't know if you can hear the drill and the hammering, but it's 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 bothering me. It's paying attention, coming into my brain. You can see why this is so important to me, right? Language is important, right? The words we use inform our beliefs inform our actions have consequences. Now, what I want to also point out is that I am not trying to say that everyone who is involved, or in fact, anyone who is involved in any of these fair trade organizations are anything other than good people. I don't know them. I don't know what their motivations are. I'm not casting aspersions on their motivations. For all I know, they're great people. And for all I know, most of them 100% fully believe and fully committed to what it is that they're doing, right? However, I believe that there is a fundamental disconnect, right, in the way we use the word fair, right? In my perception, and I hope that over the course of this hour, you have come around to what my way of thinking when it comes to institutionalized fair trade. Fair trade is represented by big non-governmental organizations that operate globally, right? That the whole notion of asking producers, right, to pay for the privilege of accepting values, right, of some other culture, right, to pay for the privilege of accepting those values and then being left with 100% of the economic risk associated with accepting those values is fundamentally unfair. And I think that we all need to go take a look at Fair Trade International, Fair Trade USA, all of these organizations that call themselves fair, that use the word fair to talk about what it is that they're doing, and ask them to say, okay, number one, are you as an organization sustainable without outside support? So Fair Trade, I want to say FLO, Fair Trade International, if you didn't get any grants from any governments or any kind of other kinds of breaks, as a business, are you sustainable, right? And if not, why not? Right? I think is a really, really good question to ask, right? Because I don't know that they are. And is it okay for them to be talking about sustainability and being sustainable when they're not sustainable themselves? I don't know that it is. For me, if I were to put together a quote unquote fair trade system, the number one element of it, right, I think is that it needs to be at net zero cost to the farmer. That in the end, there is nothing but upside for the farmer for participating, right? And I think that one of the challenges associated with the current iteration of fair trade systems is that you need hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers involved in order to be able to get to the scale, right, where these organizations can afford the certification fees, right? How come being fair is only fair when it comes to large organizations? How come we can't be fair to individual smallholders? How come individual farmers can't take advantage of the benefits of whatever these fair trade systems are, right? The answer to that question is fairly simple, is that I've got a big bureaucracy. I've got certification organizations are big bureaucracies, and these big bureaucracies need to be fed, right? And that leads to the final point that I want to make on this topic for this one, is that like Tony's Chocolate Only, fair trade organizations require that the inequity continue, right? These organizations face a fundamental conflict of interest, which is their reason for existence is the fact that this inequity exists. And if they solve the inequity, they put themselves out of business, right? And truly, are any of these fair trade organizations, right, going to put themselves out of business? And I think the answer to that question is no, they're not. And with that, real quick, Natalia from Altamira, again, thank you very much for connecting today. I had a great time when I was in Altamira, Chocolat Xingu. Unfortunately, I wasn't invited back this year. I hope to be going again in a future year. Lila, thank you for the support, and thank you for the support of the Chocolate Life, and for sharing with me, this thing about Ecuadorian tax law that I was unaware of. I would like to see that notion, right, be a part of every single one of these fair trade systems. Show us what you paid, right? Let us know what the exchange rate was on the day when the things got paid. Let us know what the price of cocoa was on the day when the transaction happened. And with that data, we can understand more about whether the price paid was in fact fair. Right? And to close out, I want to remind everybody that we've been here on the Chocolate Life Live for the last hour, and the Chocolate Life Live is in fact sponsored by the members of the Chocolate Life. If you're not a member of the Chocolate Life, please go to thechocolatelife.com right now. The link is on this page. I'm signed in, so it says account right here. But if you're not signed in, it'll say join. Click join, become a member. If you're watching on YouTube, smash the like button, share, subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're watching on LinkedIn, you're watching on Facebook, follow me, share with your friends, like, and all those kinds of things, and share the Chocolate Life and the Chocolate Life Live with friends and family who might be interested. And I'm going to close, as I always close, with the exhortation, listen, right? Chocolate makes people happy. And so if you're working with chocolate and you're not happy, you're not having fun, you might be doing it wrong. Right. So ciao, everybody.